Okay, so this is the audio review for That Powerful Drop and A Clue to the Nature of Man. Since both readings were less than a full page, I kind of squeezed them together. Alrighty. So for the first one, what Langston Hughes is referring to is the one-drop rule, right? Which was the result of racial hierarchies that were ideologies that assumed that some races were superior to others, essentializing whiteness as ideal and the top of the hierarchy. And because of the creation of whiteness, there was this motivation to protect power and hierarchy. And one way to do this was by maintaining a racial order, by legally prohibiting miscegenation or relationships or sex between people of different races. So this meant if a child was born mixed race, their race is interpreted along the social hierarchy. So if a mixed race child was born with one non-white parent, the child was no longer considered white in society. It was so heavily policed, as legal discrimination was common, only select groups of people, meaning white landowning males, had all the social privileges in society. So the term one drop is to say that if you had one black ancestor, as we technically all are from Africa, but whatever, if you had one black ancestor, and even if you looked light-skinned, you're legally considered black. So this was, again, a way to maintain the racial hierarchy for privileging, whiteness as ideal. So sociologists have often, looked at race or been interested in race, and really some of our modern understandings of, such as racial formation theory, really stand on the back of the groundbreaking work of W.B. Du Bois, who was looking at how African Americans were treated differently in the United States by looking at the time period called Reconstruction, after the Civil War and emancipation. And he saw that the real hindrance to social progress for African Americans was the lack of social opportunities that were afforded to them because of people's prejudice and discrimination. So I'm going to show you this video that kind of explains some of that background and how his theories led to racial formation and those kind of theories that they talk about in the chapter, right? Where racial formation is really just looking at how our identity is formed in relation to societal attitudes about race that we often have to contend with when we look at our own self-worth, right, or a sense of our self-worth. So I'm going to play this video real quick so you can get a sense of that history.
2 bachelor's degrees, PhD from Harvard University, 2-year fellowship to study in Berlin, professor of sociology and history at 2 different universities, author of countless books, activist and co-founder of a key civil rights organization, editor and co-founder of a magazine, and a poet to boot. Pretty good resume, yeah? What if I make it a bit more impressive? That PhD from Harvard? First Harvard PhD granted to an African American. The civil rights organization? The NAACP, that magazine, The Crisis, the longest-running black publication in the United States, in print since 1910. This resume belongs to William Edward Burghardt Du Bois, whom you might know better as W.E.B. Du Bois. He was one of the earliest American sociologists, as well as one of the first proponents of race conflict theory, and his studies of the lives of African Americans during the Jim Crow era of American history and the oppression they faced are the cornerstones of how sociologists study race. W.E.B. Du Bois was born in a small town in Massachusetts in 1868. 1868, that's 5 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, 3 years after the end of the American Civil War, and the same year that the 14th Amendment was passed. At this time, race was considered a biological construct. Slavery and the later Jim Crow laws in the South that enforced racial segregation, were framed as natural consequences of the supposed natural inferiority of blacks to whites. We, of course, now know that this was not just wrong, but deeply harmful. And more than that, the idea that race itself is a purely biological, immutable quality is also understood today as being simply untrue. Instead, race is thought of as a socially constructed category of people who share biological traits that society has deemed important. Yes, human beings vary a lot in how we look. Our skin color, our facial features, our body shapes, our hair texture, but those visual markers only become a race when members of society decide that specific markers constitute a specific racial group. This is why the concept of race often changes across cultures and times. For example, when Du Bois was alive, Irish and Italian Americans weren't considered white either. But today, try telling some Boston Southie guy or an Italian grandma from Pittsburgh that they're not white. See what they say. Did something change about Irish and Italian Americans biologically? Of course not. It's how society saw them that changed. And it's that last bit, what race a person is seen as and how they're treated as a result, that ends up being a huge determinant of a person's social outcomes. Du Bois began to consider his race as a part of his identity when he moved to the South to go to college and then spent several years in Europe. He saw how differently black people were treated in different places and was disillusioned about how Americans treated him based on his skin color. He can describe this disillusionment much better than I can. "One ever feels his two-ness," he wrote, "an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring id." This quote reveals a really critical underlying thread in much of Du Bois's work: the idea of double consciousness. Du Bois argued that there are two competing identities as a black American, seeing oneself as an American and seeing oneself as a black person while living in white-centric America. Living as a member of a non-dominant race, he said, creates a fracture in your sense of identity within that society. These feelings are what fueled Du Bois's work, which focused on the disparities and conflicts between people of different races, what we now call race conflict theory. Today, questions of race and identity are studied by sociologists who work on racial identity theory, which looks at how individuals come to identify as a certain race. Du Bois didn't only research racial identity, though. He also looked at the everyday lives of black and white Americans and wrote extensively about how and why their lives differed so drastically in post-slavery America. Let's go to the thought bubble to look at one of Du Bois's early studies of these disparities. In 1896, the University of Pennsylvania hired Du Bois to do a survey on black communities in Philadelphia. His work eventually became The Philadelphia Negro, the first published study of the living conditions of African Americans. Du Bois went knocking on doors, asking people questions about themselves and their families. And there were an awful lot of doors. All told, Du Bois collected data on 9,675 African Americans. He focused on one specific ward of Philly, the 7th Ward, a historically black neighborhood that attracted families of all classes, from doctors and teachers to the poor and destitute. He sat in thousands of parlors asking questions about age, gender, education, literacy, occupations, earnings, crime, and documented the ways in which African Americans differed from Philly's white residents. For example, the black population turned out to be much younger than the white population and had a higher proportion of women. It also had lower literacy rates, higher rates of poverty and crime, and a higher concentration of workers in the service industry than in manufacturing or trade. Mortality rates were higher, as was the frequency of illness. But here's what made Du Bois's report especially unique. He concluded that much of the dysfunction within black communities came from their inferior access to things like education and more lucrative jobs. The reason that the black population had higher rates of death and illness, he said, was because of occupational hazards and poverty and less access to healthcare. It's hard to express just how radical Du Bois's conclusions were at the time. The problems in black communities were not due to racial inferiority, Du Bois argued, but to racial prejudice. And that was completely different from how many Americans thought at the time. Thanks, Thought Bubble. So race doesn't exist in a vacuum. It doesn't just imbue you with certain essential qualities. Instead, race matters because of the power that society gives it. For another example, let's stick with Philly and use the labor unions there in the 1890s. Because of prejudice against black workers and beliefs about their abilities and morals, trade labor unions didn't allow black workers to join. And because they couldn't join unions, many black workers couldn't get manufacturing or trade work, which paid much better than service work. And because they couldn't get these jobs, black communities had more men out of work, higher rates of poverty, and more criminal behavior, which then allowed the white workers and unions to justify their decision to not allow black workers into their union. The prevailing beliefs about race and racism ultimately reinforced themselves. This is what's now known as racial formation theory, a theory formalized by modern sociologists Michael Omi and Howard Winant. Racial formation refers to the process through which social, political, and economic forces influence how a society defines racial categories, and how those racial categories in turn end up shaping those forces. Omi and Winant argue that the concept of race came about as a tool to justify and maintain the economic and political power held by those of European descent. Another modern look at these issues can be seen in the work of sociologist William Julius Wilson. He explores why black and white Americans tend to have such different outcomes in terms of income, education, and more. And he argues that class, not race, is the determining factor for many black Americans. But the reasons that these class gaps exist to begin with come from the structural disadvantages that date back to Du Bois's time. Du Bois continued to research the ways in which prejudice, segregation, and lack of access to education and jobs were holding back African Americans. A strong advocate of education and of challenging Jim Crow laws, he clashed with another leading black intellectual of the time, Booker T. Washington, who advocated compromise with the predominantly white political system. Over time, Du Bois grew frustrated with the limits of scholarship in effecting change, so he turned to direct activism and political writing. In 1909, he co-founded the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP, and was the editor and intellectual driving force behind its magazine, The Crisis. The NAACP fought against lynching, segregation of schools, voting disenfranchisement, and much more. It used journalism as one of its most powerful tools, publishing the records of thousands of lynchings over a 30-year period, and it used lawsuits targeting voter disenfranchisement disenfranchisement and school segregation in decade-long court battles. And after Du Bois's time, it went on to become part of many of the landmark moments in the fight for civil rights, including the Brown versus Board of Education case, the Montgomery bus boycott, and the March on Washington. Modern sociologists continue Du Bois's work on racial politics, asking the question, how is race intertwined with political power and the institutional structures within a society? Sociologist Eduardo Bonilla Silva, for example, argues that we now have what he calls racism without racists. What he means is explicitly racist views have become less socially acceptable, so fewer people are willing to say that they don't think black and white Americans should have equal rights. But, as Bonilla Silva points out, that doesn't mean racism is a thing of the past. Instead, he says, structural racism, the kind that's entrenched in political and legal structures, still holds back the progress of racial minorities. Take, for example, the fact that the median wealth of white Americans is 13 times higher than the median wealth of black Americans. Now, you could look at that and say, well, black people just aren't as good at saving as white people. After all, it's not like there's anything legally preventing them from making or saving more money. But that completely ignores the ways in which wealth builds up over generations. Past generations of black Americans were unable to build wealth because they had far less access to higher incomes, banking services, and housing. These ideas about how the structures of power interact with race may have their origins in Du Bois's work, but they continue today. And so do his studies of racial resistance. Researchers of racial resistance ask, how do different racial groups challenge and change the structures of power? Sometimes racial resistance is easy to see in society. Think the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s, or Black Lives Matter today. But sociologists can also look at more subtle forms of resistance too, like resistance against racial ideas and stereotypes. For example, sociologist Patricia Hill Collins has written about the different relationships that black and white women have had with marriage and staying home to raise a family. In the feminist movement of the 1960s and 70s, one of its key issues was the exclusion of women from the workforce. Entering the workforce was seen as a form of resistance. But black women have, for most of American history, been forced to work or needed to work to help support their families. For them, Collins argues, joining the workforce is not resistance. Instead, staying at home to care for their families can be an act of resistance against society's expectations for black women. All of these modern fields of study within race conflict theory, racial identity, racial formation, racial politics, and racial resistance, they all have their origins in the work of one sociologist, W.E.B. Du Bois. Today we talked about W.E.B. Du Bois, one of the founders of sociological thought and the founder of race conflict theory. We talked about race and how our understanding of how we define race has changed over time. We talked about Du Bois's idea of double consciousness and how it relates to the modern-day field of racial identity. We introduced the idea of racial formation and used Du Bois's survey of African Americans in Philadelphia to look at how economic, political, and social structures affect how we perceive different races, and vice versa. And finally, we looked at the activist side of Du Bois's life as co-founder of the NAACP and editor of The Crisis, and discussed how modern-day sociologists study racial politics and racial resistance.
Okay, so Tim Wise, he really argues that the concept of whiteness is a colonial invention, that it wasn't until colonial America that people defined themselves that way, right? In Europe, people didn't consider themselves white. They considered themselves related to their nation of origin, right? And how this was really done as a way to kind of it was intended to separate and really control poor indentured Europeans and enslaved Africans that at the time were forming coalitions because they realized they were both getting screwed. And basically by offering up whiteness as a step up the racial hierarchy, a lot of people bought into what he calls the racial bribe. This idea that your skin color is more important than your economic or social station in life. And therefore, white people were given, there was an end to indenture. There was, you were given property, you were given the right to testify in a trial, and all these kind of things that were like a little carrot that he talks about in the clip were offered as a way to divide and conquer, right? To make sure that the racial hierarchy was kept in order because the elites did not want to work and have to actually do the labor themselves. They had to make sure that others would do the labor for them. So really, he talks about how our racial understandings of whiteness are really an American invention that we have to think about critically when we're talking about race as to how this hierarchy exists. We tend to ignore the dominant group when we're analyzing race. So it's important to understand how the concept of whiteness came to be and how it came to be the hegemonic value of America.
Because if you know the history of the whole concept of whiteness, if you know the history of the whole concept of the white race, where it came from and for what reason, you know that it was a trick and it's worked brilliantly. See, prior to the mid to late 1600s in the colonies of what would become the United States, there was no such thing as the white race. Those of us of European descent did not refer to ourselves by that term really ever before then. In fact, in the old countries of Europe, we had spent most of our time killing each other. We didn't love each other. We weren't one big happy family. The side of my family that comes from Scotland, hell, they didn't even worry about fighting people outside of Scotland. Highlanders and Lowlanders just fought the hell out of each other. So there was no white race, but in the colonies of what would become the United States, what did we see in the 1660s, 1670s? We began to see that Africans of indentured servant status, many of them not enslaved yet, they were not necessarily permanently enslaved. Some were, others were indentured like many poor Europeans for periods of 7 to 11 years. They could work off their indenture and then they would be free labor technically. Realized, as did the white indentured servants, the Europeans who hadn't even been called white yet, that they had a lot of things in common, like the fact that they were all getting their clock cleaned by the elite. And so they would get together more than our history books taught us, to foment rebellion against the elite, to try to get a better deal for themselves on the basis of economic necessity and economic justice. And what did the elite do? When you see that you're outnumbered by black and white folks who are penniless, landless, peasants, you have to do one of two things. You either have to kill them all, but you can't do that because who's going to work? Rich folks weren't going to. They had to get poor people to work. The whole point was to be a person of leisure back in those days. That was the goal, was not to work. So you couldn't kill them all. You didn't want to kill them all. You had to do the work yourself. You had to build your own levee, build your own house. No. Pick your own tobacco, harvest your own cotton. No, we're not going to do any of that. So you can't kill them, but you can co-opt them. And so the elite in Virginia, for example, in the colony, begins to give certain carrots to people of European descent, saying things like, you know, we're going to let you own a little land, not much, but just a little. And we're going to get rid of indentured servitude. Now you're free labor. And by the way, once you're free labor, you get 50 acres of land just because you're free labor, see? So we're going to cut you in on this deal. We're going to let you enter into contracts. We're going to let you testify in court. And here's the best of all. We're going to put you on the slave patrol to keep those people in line, right? The idea was you're still going to get your clock cleaned. We still don't like you. We still aren't going to really empower you or change your economic subordination, but we're going to make you honorary members of this team, and you're going to help us keep those other people down. And so they got a little taste of power, and it did effectively divide and conquer those coalitions. Those rebellions began to stop almost instantly. Fast forward to the Civil War era, you have rich white folks in the South, where I come from, standing up and openly admitting that the reason they're prepared to secede from the Union, and the only reason they ever articulated publicly, ever, was to maintain and extend slavery and white supremacy not only where it already existed, but into the newly acquired, that is to say, stolen territories from Mexico to the west. That was what they said. Now we lie about it. We say it wasn't about slavery, that it was about states' rights. Yes, the right of the states to keep and maintain slaves, exactly. But back then they had no shame, so they didn't try and cover it up. They openly said it, but once again, the rich didn't want to go do the work. Are you kidding? No. They're going to get poor people to go fight for them. And the poor folks didn't even own slaves. Now think, how do you get poor people who don't even own the shirt on their back, let alone slaves, to go fight to keep your slaves for you? You've got to convince them that their skin is more important than their economic interest. Because think about it, if I am a farmer who has to charge you $1 a day or $2 a week to work on your farm and harvest that tobacco or pick that cotton, but you can get a black person to do it for free because you own them, who's going to get the job? Not me. In other words, slavery actually undermined the wages and the wage base, the economic floor of the typical white working class or low-income person. But they were told, if these people are freed, they're going to take your job. No, fool, they got your job. That's the point. And so at some level, again, working class white people being harmed by white privilege, relatively being advantaged, right? Being given a leg up, being given a membership to the club, but in absolute terms being kept economically subordinated by the very thing that gave them a sense of superiority. How's that for irony? Then in the present era, this hasn't stopped. This is not ancient history. Now we have people running around insisting that we should close the border with Mexico because if we don't, the wages of working class people will continue to fall. The implication being that the only reason workers are paid like crap in this country is because the border is open. But if you believe that, you would actually have to believe that if that border were closed, that all these owners of capital and industry would just say, oh, well, you figured us out. Here, it's a raise. Do we really believe that the only thing keeping bosses from paying people more is the presence of low-wage, medium, semi-skilled labor from south of this artificial border? Is that really what we believe? We know that if that border is closed, it isn't going to be closed to capital. It isn't going to be closed to goods. If you have a border that can be crossed by capital looking for the highest return on investment or goods looking for the highest price, but labor is chained to its country of origin, how is that going to work to the benefit of working people? By definition, it doesn't. By definition, it immiserates the working class. Divide and conquer. But the best example of all, perhaps, in the contemporary era, in the greater New Orleans area after Katrina. Here you have two communities that were the most hard hit. The lower Ninth Ward, mostly black community, 94% African American, about 40% official poverty rate, heavy working class community. And right across the canal, St. Bernard Parish, Chalmette, 95% white, also working class, high levels of poverty, economically very similar. And at the end of the day, in those first few days of September 2005, more similar than they probably would have realized. Because when those levees broke, they all got their stuff jacked. They all got their stuff destroyed. But if you had asked white folks in Chalmette, and I've done it, who was the cause of the problems in the greater New Orleans area prior to that flooding, they would have pointed across that canal at those black folks, wouldn't have called them black folks, and would have said, there, that's the problem. 70% of the white folks in St. Bernard Parish voted for David Duke, white supremacist, neo-Nazi, former head of the largest Ku Klux Klan group in the United States when he ran for governor in 1991. 7 out of 10 gladly voted for him because he was blaming black folks for all of their problems, and they bought it. What's the irony? The irony is that while they were blaming black people for their problems, while they were blaming black people for the conditions of the greater New Orleans area in which they lived, nobody was paying attention, least of all they, to the fact that these white elite politicians, either in Baton Rouge or in Washington, whose job it was to secure those levees, to make sure that levee funds were spent in the proper way and that they were spent at all, those mostly white and mostly elite politicians did nothing. At the end of the day, it wasn't just the black folks in the lower Ninth Ward they didn't care about. They really couldn't have given a rat's ass about those poor and working class white folks either. And yet, when the people of Chalmette, people of St. Bernard Parish got back into session, first time they had a city council meeting, parish council meeting after the flooding, the lights aren't even on yet. The water isn't even hooked up. And the first order of business was to pass an ordinance saying that you couldn't rent property in St. Bernard Parish to anyone who wasn't a blood relative. Now, I'll leave it to your imagination as to why you'd want to pass a law. That law had never existed before, but now that it's been emptied out and you don't know who might come back, that's a damn good way to keep black people out, isn't it? Because if you're 95% white to begin with, if you pass an ordinance that says that, that's a great, you can't say no blacks need apply, you can't say no blacks allowed, but that was an ingenious way to get around the law. Now, they got caught, there was a lawsuit threatening, they got rid of the ordinance, but my point in bringing it up is to say, once again, divide and conquer is working. These white folks in Chalmette need to march across that canal and join hands with the black folks who've been sitting there more than willing to work with them for an awful long time and march on Baton Rouge and march on D.C. and march on the Corps of Engineers and recognize their commonality of interest. But the whiteness and the lure of whiteness has tricked these have nothing in their bank account white people into believing that they got more in common with the rich white folks on St. Charles Avenue that didn't lose anything in that flooding than they have in common with the black working class folks who live about 500 yards away.
So the social power of race and racial categories is still very prevalent today, and it still structures people's lives and experiences differently because of our societal racial hierarchy, as well as the racist beliefs of older generations that were embedded into our social institutions that still exist today, such as the government or criminal justice system. So we'll be talking about that critically in the future. All right, so as far as occluded the nature of man, they're really looking at the importance of symbols in how we understand and identify things in our social world. So basically they're saying, or the author's saying that the symbolic system is not simply a reaction to stimuli, but again, an interpretation of it as well. So since we're encountering stimuli in the social world that are subjective, our interpretations of it, our emotional connections to it, the way we label and understand things is really going to affect the way that we interpret them and then act upon them or react to them. So there's a quote from the reading that I think really explains this whole language, myth, art, and religion aspect, which is, quote, man does not live in a world of hard facts or according to his immediate needs and desires. He lives rather in the midst of imagining emotions, in hopes and fears, in illusions and delusions, in his fantasies and dreams. So again, our reality is a social reality more so than an objective external reality. So the way that we understand these things is really through our signs and symbols and values that we've embedded within our language. So he also argues that rationality is an inherent feature of human activities. So he argues that even in mythology, there is some sort of conceptual form. The ideas may be nonsensical, but they make sense within their own context. And in the same way, language often appears rational as well. It seems like an external objective thing, but there's an emotional aspect to language. So the author gives the example of poetry, right, which uses language but does not express really thoughts or ideas. It instead conveys our feelings and affections. So this is a good example of how language is a bit more subjective than we tend to acknowledge, and much more a reflection of our cultural realities than some inherent external state of nature.